Well, Parliament has risen and probably won't come back before an election is called. Yes, the guessing game has begun. Well, it's been well underway for quite some time over when the Prime Minister will call it. Both sides have been rehearsing their campaign pitches during this past week of Parliament, readying for the starter's gun to be fired. But look, there's one man who could really disrupt even the best laid campaign plans, and that man is, of course, Donald Trump, the US president. He's just announced so-called reciprocal tariffs on countries that trade with the US. Now, that might sound benign, but it could completely disrupt the global trading system, depending on what they actually involve. I mean, these reciprocal tariffs, for example, he's indicated could be used in response to things like the European Union's value-added tax, a bit like our GST. That could be seen as a trade measure and see new tariffs imposed. So, look, then on top of that, there's the threat of direct tariffs on steel and aluminium that Donald Trump was talking about earlier in the week. He's considering giving Australia an exemption on those, but it's still very unsure, and Australia is absolutely on edge about this. So why are some of the trade hawks around Donald Trump urging him not to give any exemption to Australia? Why do they believe previous assurances from Australia were broken? And what's going to happen more broadly in terms of the global economic impact of what Donald Trump's talking about here? That's what I'm keen to explore. I'm David Speers on Ngunnawal Country at Parliament House in Canberra. Welcome to Insiders on Background. Well, Arthur Sinodinos is a former Australian ambassador to the United States and joins me now. Arthur Sinodinos, good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you, David.
We'll get to aluminium and steel and whether Australia did breach any previous assurances to the United States on that. But just on the reciprocal tariffs that Trump has announced, what's he talking about here? Is it clear?
Well, what he's talking about is not just the tariffs that other countries levy on the Americans and whether they're higher than American tariffs on them. He's also talking about export subsidies, non-tariff barriers, taking into account, in other words, all the ways in which other countries allegedly seek to get a competitive advantage at the expense of the US. So this is a pretty complicated exercise. If they're going to look at a whole range of government policies that impact on the costs and competitiveness of American products overseas as compared to the tariffs and other measures that America levies. So this is not an easy... He wants it done quickly, but this is not an easy thing to do in a small window of time.
Well, exactly, because he's going to go through, or they're going to go through each country, starting with, I guess, the ones they're most concerned about, and then presumably we're at near the bottom of the list. We have the US has a trade surplus with Australia, so we're not as big a concern. Nonetheless, if he does start hitting the Europeans, China and so on, we're going to feel the indirect impact of that. But going through each country will, as you say, take some time. And it's looking at, I mentioned the value-added tax in Europe has already been mentioned by Trump, but looking at everything, I mean, it could include all sorts of industry supports that a country might be giving.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And in the case of Australia with the GST, we levy that on consumption, which includes imported goods. It's a 10% tax.
I mean, we impose it on homemade goods as well. So
yes, yeah, but that's the point. It's meant to tax consumption, but that includes an imported component, and so that may well factor in the mix when they're looking at Australia's tariff and other barriers. Even though we have a trade surplus, they have a trade surplus.
Things like, we have this media bargaining code that's meant to, require Google and Facebook and so on to pay for news content that they publish. That sort of thing might be looked at as well by the US as an unfair trade practice.
Well, the tech bros would be particularly interested in things like the age restriction on social media. With the news code, they'd be interested in the threat of taxes being levied on the tech giants if they don't bargain under the news code. That may be done, something that's looked at separately, or it may be thrown into this exercise. So essentially, the world trading system is being thrown on its head, and the World Trade Organization has been effectively sort of not just sidelined, but potentially euthanized.
The World Trade Organization potentially euthanized, and the trading system that's been in place for decades turned on its head. What does this mean for the global economy?
Well, to the extent that average tariff rates across the world go up, particularly on some of our major trading partners like China and Japan, that, as you alluded to before, will have an indirect effect on Australia. But anything that increases costs and makes it harder to have global trade and investment or causes a slowdown in the world economy will impact on us. So the idea that we can just narrowly focus on things like steel and aluminium tariffs, that's not the game. The game is much bigger.
This is the point. What he's announced is a much bigger potential impact than any specific steel and aluminium tariff, certainly as far as Australia is concerned.
Absolutely, and it's not just about how we're hit directly, it's those indirect impacts that I talked about before. The other thing is we are, a middle-sized, open economy. Global trade and investment is very important to us, so anything that undermines that is a problem for us as a system. And also, don't forget, this is a component of that global rules-based order that the US has underwritten since World War II. So we're seeing another very direct way in which America first is leading to effectively America only if we're not careful.
And this could push up prices globally, including in the United States, right? So this could have a big inflationary impact.
It'll have an inflationary impact. How big it is, we'll have to wait and see on the final outcomes. But as far as the Fed is concerned, in the United States, in terms of interest rate policy, they'll be monitoring this to see what the upward pressures on prices will be. So it may mean that interest rates stay higher for longer than some people had anticipated, which in turn could have an impact on what happens to interest rates in Australia. So if you're the Reserve Bank, you'll be taking into account not just domestic conditions, but how global conditions could change.
Well, I tell you what, that's the last thing the Albanese government wants is any reason not to cut interest rates right now. But the other thing that may well drop mid-campaign is a decision from Donald Trump on those steel and aluminium tariffs. So it sounds like they had a positive phone call, the Prime Minister and the President. He's happy to say that he's considering an exemption for Australia. But then we heard his Chief Trade Advisor, Peter Navarro, saying Australia shouldn't get any carve-out here. They breached previous assurances when we gave them an exemption last time around. I just want to explore what happened.
Sure.
You're a former ambassador there. You weren't there when some of these arrangements were put in place, but just to go through the timeline. 2018, Donald Trump puts these tariffs in place and agrees to an Australian exemption. I think Malcolm Turnbull was our Prime Minister at the time. Then 2019... what happened? Our aluminium exports actually shot up. Why did that happen?
I wasn't there in 2019, but I assume what happened is that in the natural way of things, trade was increasing, so they went up, and I think it was at that stage that there was the meeting in the margins of a G7 or G20 meeting.
Trump's people get pretty angry. I'm told it was foreign traders taking advantage of Australia being a backdoor without its tariff to get more aluminium to the United States. So the Trump administration goes, hang on, we've got to stop this. Scott Morrison's then the Prime Minister, and they do an agreement that's a little vague, but apparently includes, from what I'm told, some assurances that it's certified Australian aluminium and some sort of verbal agreements around limiting so that we're not going to go above a certain level. Was that the arrangement?
Yes, that was as it was explained to me when I took up the job. So the idea was to monitor the volumes of steel and aluminium into the US to see that they don't go above a certain threshold level, and then convey that to the companies, and then the companies should take action to restrain their exports.
And what were those levels? Were they basically pre-2018 levels? Were they 2017 levels?
They were meant to be a historical baseline as of around 2018. But again, because of the nature of the agreement, a verbal agreement, I never saw anything written on paper.
Is that right? How does that work? You're basically told we've got this arrangement. It's pretty sensitive with the Trump administration.
That's right.
But it's verbal, and is that because it would be in breach of World Trade Organization rules to have something in writing like that?
Possibly, but that's not how it was explained to me. It was just put in terms of this is the agreement we've got. And this is what we need to enforce. I mean, I wasn't directly involved in enforcing it, but there were one or two conversations involving the US Trade Representative, including between Simon Birmingham and him over this issue while I was there. So we were sensitive to it during that I was there for the last year of Trump during that period. But then, really, we got consumed with other things like COVID.
Yeah, and I want to come to that.
Whatever.
But so just from what you've said, you're aware of this verbal agreement, obviously at the ministerial level, Simon Birmingham and the US Trade Representative are keeping a very close eye on this. It's basically not to ensure that not too much aluminium and steel is being sold into the United States. But then what follows, the Biden administration comes in, we go through the end of COVID, sanctions are imposed on Russia after it invades Ukraine. And what happened then? Because you were there at that time.
Well, I mean, as has been documented, there was a surge in exports of aluminium to the US, partly at the expense of Russia because of the sanctions that were going on. But that didn't seem to arouse any particular ire on I mean, the Bidenistas on the whole were pretty relaxed about this, I think, both before and after. But certainly after, the impression I had is there was a surge, but then it tailed off.
Did they want more Australian aluminium because they couldn't take it from Russia?
I think that was a large part of it, but it wasn't a major preoccupation of the embassy, I have to say, at that time, given everything else we were doing.
All right, so then Trump's back now, and Peter Navarro's back now, the trade hawk, who's his chief advisor, and he's pointing to all of this and saying, well, hang on, Australia breached all these assurances or promises or verbal agreements, whatever you call them. Does he have a point?
Well, look, it's an argument of convenience. I don't believe that it holds up completely, but certainly there were times when we had to sort of convey back to Australia and through people in Australia to companies that they had to keep an eye on the volumes. But look, this is a red herring. I'll tell you why. What Navarro and the hawks in the White House are interested in is getting as many tariffs as high as possible and with as few exceptions as possible. Their aim is not just to negotiate on fentanyl or immigration. They want to restore, in their eyes, more manufacturing in the United States. They've peddled this idea for a while now that the US has been deindustrialized and that therefore they are about the reindustrialization of America, bring back manufacturing and help the working class and the middle class in that way. This is their agenda, and they will use whatever argument, whatever smokescreen they can, but this is what it's all about.
And look, last time around, Trump presidency Mark I, those voices were in his ear, but so were, strong alliance supporters who argued Australia shouldn't be hit. I'm thinking people like Jim Mattis, the Defence Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary. Are those voices no longer there telling Trump just go easy a bit on the trade? Is he just getting one-sided trade hawk advice now?
Look, he's come into office determined to do a number of things, and he's collected around him people who are very much like-minded. This time he's had a much greater say in who are his people, from Mar-a-Lago onwards. Susie Wiles, the Chief of Staff, all the people in the White House that they've picked, and the Cabinet picks as well, picked for their loyalty, their capacity to convey Trump's message. So he's got people around him who share his worldview.
And he's far more emboldened than last time, right? He's had a bigger election win, and trade was a big part of it.
Yeah. Winning the popular vote as well as the Electoral College was very important to him. He's got the Supreme Court, he feels, behind him. He feels at the moment like he's got unfettered power. He's going to push the law as far as he can and dare the courts and everyone else to pull him back. And he's got in Navarro, the Commerce Secretary, Lutnick, the USTR, Jameson Greer, people who are very much on the same page as him. This is all about reindustrializing America, investing in America. Investing in America is the best place in the world to do that, et cetera, et cetera.
And look, as I mentioned earlier, we should be at the bottom of the list. They've got a trade surplus with us, right? We're hardly the problem when it comes to, too many imports to the United States. But we hear these people like Navarro keep mentioning Australia. They've got long memories, and they've got, this grudge, it sounds like. So where does this leave us? Do you think ultimately we will see those steel and aluminium tariffs imposed on Australia?
You'd have to say at the moment the odds are more than 50-50 that we won't get an exemption. We'll wait and see. You're right, some of the defence and security people may argue, look, they're a good ally, etc. But look, this is business. This is economics, ask not what America can do for you, but what you can do for America. That is the world we are in.
So what should Australia be doing? What should the Prime Minister be doing, or indeed if there's a change of government? Dealing with this environment, is it about trying to appease and tread carefully and say, oh, but we're great mates and we've been together in all these wars and you've got a trade surplus with us, so it's all okay? Or do you muscle up and be a bit more assertive and push back and say, hang on, we'll hit you back if you hit us?
Well, in one sense, it's all of the above. I mean, on the one hand, we do have to maintain the military and defence and security relationship. It's very important for our security as it is for theirs. So playing with that is dangerous. Retaliation, we have to weigh up the costs to us of doing that. And I note the government recently has ruled out retaliation if we're not granted an exemption on these particular tariffs. Look, in the long run, we have to think about how we club together with like-minded countries in our region and in Europe and elsewhere who are seeking collectively to push back, if you like, and try and create a more favourable trading environment than the one we potentially face. The other macro issue for Australia is in dealing with the US, we just have to be more confident, on the front foot, work out, well, okay, what are the things we can do to mutual advantage? Look, these characters, right, a lot of them are from business, they're hard-edged, they're tough, but if you get in there, talk to them, have proposals to put on the table, carry yourself with a certain degree of confidence. The problem with saying appeasement is it sounds too defensive, like we're in a crouching position trying to minimise the damage that might be rained down on us. We've got to be on the front foot and we've got to be confident about what we bring to the table. The other element of this, and this is a separate element but related, is as an economy, we have just got to do everything we can in this environment to be stronger, more productive, more prosperous, more high-performing. The Canadians have found this. I've spoken to a few Canadians over recent times, and they're saying they feel particularly vulnerable to the US because their economy and their defence have sort of run down over time. So they're feeling less confident in dealing with the US. So I think that part of it is how we conduct and comport ourselves.
Listening to you there, I mean, are you saying we need to be more confident in pushing back a bit on this trade stuff from Trump?
Yeah, and I'm not casting aspersions on either Albanese or Dutton in this regard. What I'm saying is the way to deal with these characters and the advice that Australia is getting from some people in Washington, Australian officials and others, is very much be on the front foot, go in there with specific proposals to do things that are of mutual benefit. You've got a new person as a customer, in inverted commas, in Washington. Work out what pushes that customer's buttons.
Like what? What sort of proposals should they take?
So for example, critical minerals. That's an area which is important for national security, both in the US and Australia. It's important for defence materials in particular, but it's important for other reasons as well. And that's an area where Australia has a lot to offer. Trump is interested in this sort of thing.
And
for example,
so is China. So is that something we could say, this is at stake, access to Australia's critical minerals?
And what we would argue is that access to critical minerals allows countries like Australia and the US to reduce our dependence on the supply chains, many of which for critical minerals go through China. And we know Trump is interested because he's offered the Ukrainians a deal, more sort of arms in exchange for rare earths and other minerals in Ukraine. So it's something that's on his mind, and it's something that also he's interested in relation to Greenland.
So to put it bluntly, should we use it as a bargaining chip and say, if you hit us with tariffs on steel and aluminium, access to critical minerals might not be as easy?
No, I don't think you start with a threat like that. You try and put it more positively in terms of, look, there are all these ways we can work together. First of all, we need to be exporting as much as we can to the US so we can afford to buy the aeroplanes and everything else you've identified as things that you sell to Australia. And then, for us to be able to buy more from the US, we need to be able to sell critical minerals. But these are also critical minerals which are important in the context of our competition with China on security grounds.
And a final one, you mentioned clubbing together with like-minded countries when it comes to dealing with Donald Trump on trade. We are an island nation that relies so heavily on free trade. Should Australia play a lead role in trying to build that club, find like-minded countries who can defend the need for free trade at this moment?
Well, in the past, we have done this. If you look at some of the rounds that we've led in the World Trade Organization and its predecessor, the Uruguay round or whatever, we've been a country that's brought coalitions together to work on issues. Now, of course, there's always dangers that countries get picked off, so collective action doesn't always work. But I think, frankly, we've got to give these things a go.
Arthur Sinodinos, always good to chat, particularly at quite an uncertain time when it comes to trade and the global economy. Thanks very much for that.
Thank you.
And if you have any thoughts on this conversation, do drop us a line, insiders@abc.net.au. Now, I need to let you know that as of next week, this Insiders on Background podcast is going to be available on the ABC's new home for all the best politics podcasts. It's called Politics Now. And it will publish, our one will publish every Saturday morning on that feed. So to find all the episodes of the On Background podcast from next week, just search for Politics Now on the Listen app. We'll be talking more about the Donald Trump trade threat on Sunday morning on the couch. Hope you can join us then for Insiders, 9 a.m. on ABC TV.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.